Hey guys, Ben here with Oddly Armed, and today we're going to be tackling one of the giants of the gun world, and that's going to be the AK series of rifles. Now, the one I'm going to be hitting in particular here today is going to be a Bulgarian SLR-107FR, which is kind of a Bulgarian version of an AK-103 from Russia. So we'll go ahead, talk about that rifle, answer some questions on the history of the AK, and if I was an idiot when I was 22. So let's go ahead and get into it and talk about the history of the AK. And real quick, I want to give a big thank you to the Echo Valley Training Center in Cape on Hill, West Virginia, which is where I did the accuracy testing for this rifle. And then last weekend, I was doing a pistol class up there with Alps Traumgruppe. So if you're in the DC metro area, if you want some training, go ahead and please check them out. All right, now before getting too deep into the history, I just want to do a quick disclaimer here. The history of the AK-47 platform is really a college level course in its own right, and there's a ton of twists and turns. It is the most produced rifle of all times, and of course many different countries have produced many different variants. So I'm going to do my best to get the actual Russian lineage of the AK, which eventually led to this Bulgarian model here, out of the way. The story of the AK starts back in World War II after the Germans invaded Russia in Operation Barbarossa. The Russians, of course, came into contact with a lot of German weaponry, and some of it had some pretty big impacts on the way that the Russians did things. Now, the biggest thing that they ran into was the Sturmgewehr 44, the MP43, all of its different variants, and in particular, its round, the 7.92 by 33 millimeter cartridge, which was really the first in the line of intermediate caliber cartridges, which eventually led to the Russians developing the 7.62 by 39 cartridge that this rifle and most of your early AK-47s and AKMs are chambered in. And real quickly, I'll touch on the idea of the Sturmgewehr 44 being the first assault rifle. So the term assault rifle really refers to a rifle that's chambered in an intermediate caliber. So that 7.92 by 33, 7.62 by 39, 5.56 by 45, or pretty much any variation on those cartridges, along with being select fire, so you have to have the capability to do semi-automatic as well as either 3-round burst or some number of bursts and full auto fire. And that's basically what you need to have an actual assault rifle. So before World War II, there were a couple of rifles which could technically click that box, and the biggest one being the Russian Automat Fedorov, which was an interesting rifle chambered in 6.5 Japanese. However, that was kind of towards World War I, and it wasn't really utilized in a way that assault rifles would later be used. So after the Germans had captured a couple of the STG-44s or MP-43s, along with that 7.92 by 33 round, they went ahead and developed their own cartridge off of that, which was where we got the 7.62 by 39 millimeter, and that was developed in around 1943. And at that point, they started looking for different rifles that could potentially chamber that caliber to replace the Mosin Nagants, which were getting incredibly old in their service. And now we can get into Mikhail Kalashnikov, the original designer of the AK-47. Now, there's a ton of stuff out there about his life, including his own biography on it, so I would absolutely recommend checking stuff like that out if you want to get the full in-depth story on Mikhail Kalashnikov. But long story short, he was very mechanically minded throughout his entire life, like to know how things work, take them apart, put them back together, stuff like that. So the way that he got into the AK in particular was in early World War II, he was a tanker, so he was fighting on T-34s. In 1941, in the Battle of Bryansk, he was injured in the shoulder, which forced him to go to a convalescence home to recover after the battle. And while he was there, there's a bunch of stories about how he saw different soldiers there and heard about the STG-44 and how the Russians didn't have anything like that. They were still using their Mosins and then the Papasha and the PPS-43 as well. So he went ahead and started his own designs, particularly on a submachine gun at first. Now in 1944, Mikhail Kalashnikov got his hands on the M43 cartridge, that 7.62 by 39 that the Russians had been working on. And he entered one of his designs in a trial to replace the Mosin Nagant as well as some other rifles that they were using at the time, to include the SVT-40. And those trials were eventually won by Simonov's design, the SKS-45, which is still obviously popular to this day. Now, he would go on and continue into a separate trial to replace the submachine guns in around 1946. And that's where we got the original design for the AK-47. Now, Kalashnikov's designs went through a series of trials between 1946 and then 1949 when the trials were finally finished and the original AK-47 was adopted by the Soviet military. One thing that actually comes up quite a bit when talking about the AK is its design lineage, as far as some people think it's basically a copy of the Sturmgewehr 44 from Germany. Now, when you look at it, the design itself, it really is not. There's a lot of differences between the STG-44 and the AK. Biggest one being the way that the bolt actually locks. On the Sturmgewehr, it used a tilting bolt to lock the mechanism versus the rotating bolt that was in the AK. And if you actually look at the way the AK works, it's more similar to the US M1 Garand. As far as its influence goes, that's probably where it got most of its design ideology. And I'm really just going to be hitting the wave tops on the rest of its history, but for the early AK, you had multiple generations of receivers, and generally there's 4 known that we really talk about. So the Type 1 receiver was the first one adopted in 1949, and that actually used a stamped receiver. However, that receiver was known to have quite a few issues. In the prototypes, it was fine, but you'll still see this nowadays where in the prototype phase with hand-fitted rifles, it's going to work great. But when it hits the reality of mass production and QC, you start having problems. So they started having issues with receiver flex, stuff like that. And Russian technology, as far as stamping goes, wasn't quite as advanced as it was for the Germans at this point. So given the issues with the Type 1 stamp receivers, they decided to move to a forged receivers for the next 2 generations. So the Gen 2 is going to be that forged steel receiver. So it's basically a block of steel that they mill out for all the different components that you need in there. There are some slight differences between the Type 2 receiver and the Type 3. The biggest thing you're going to see is for the Type 2, there's a socket in the stock to hold this, or socket at the back of the receiver to hold the stock on. And then the Type 3, which is the most produced AK-47 milled receiver, they get rid of that, but otherwise externally it looks very similar. Throughout the years, though, they continued to work on that original stamped receiver design because there are some serious downsides to the milled receiver. Biggest ones being weight. It weighs over a pound more than the stamped receiver, and then also costs, because milled receivers are extremely expensive and time-consuming to actually make. So by 1959, they had finally perfected the stamping procedure for the receiver, and that's when you get the AKM. The AKM is really the most common type of 7.62 by 39 millimeter AK that you're going to see across the world. And the vast majority of copies from different comm block nations are going to be AKM variants. Again, because it's that stamped receiver design, which is going to be quite a bit lighter than that original milled receiver and is way cheaper to produce. So the AKM served communist nations, so the USSR, for quite a long time. And the Russians eventually developed a 545 by 39 millimeter cartridge after seeing the US 556 millimeter cartridge in action in Vietnam. So the Soviets married that 545 caliber cartridge with the original design of the AKM, and that's where we got the AK-74 in 1974. Now, some of the more positive attributes of the 545 over the original 7.62 by 39 is it is definitely a little bit lighter, as well as it's more accurate than that original 7.62 by 39 cartridge. The AK-74 served with the Russians through the 1980s in Afghanistan, but in 1991 they released an AK-74M, or modernized model. So if you see M behind basically any Russian piece of equipment, T90M, T72M, AKM, it basically means a more modernized version of it. So think an A1 variant or A2 variant in the US. So the AK-74M model introduced a couple of new things to the design. One of the biggest things is going to be a side-folding polymer stock, and then also a couple of changes to the original muzzle brake that was included on the AK-74. But in 1991, that was adopted and equipped the entire Russian armed services, and that's been utilized up until today. They're looking at adopting the AK-12 or 15. However, that still hasn't fully equipped their forces. Using the enhancements from the AK-74M, Kalashnikov went ahead and designed a new family of AK rifles called the Century series. So that's going to be the AK-102, 103, 104. a bunch of different variants, and essentially they had the rifle version for 545, 556, 762 by 39, as well as carbine versions, so shorter ones with an integrated front sight gas block on them. And the 762 by 39 rifle length version was known as the AK-103, and that's where the SLR-107FR kind of comes from, because this is more or less a Bulgarian take on a Russian AK-103. While a lot of different countries in the communist bloc manufactured AK variants, the Bulgarians are known for having one of the better AKs. So something like Romanian AKs are generally going to be a little bit lower quality in terms of fit and finish overall than the Bulgarian ones, which are closer, if not a little bit better than the actual Russian ones. Now, getting into the AK community, there's a lot of arguments on who builds the best AK, but I would say that Bulgaria is definitely one of the top producers out there. Now, there's actually two different arsenals in this story. The first one is going to be Arsenal AD in Bulgaria. So that's a company and the factory, it was Circle 10, that originally produced these rifles, the receivers, all of that stuff. Now, when AKs are imported into the US, they don't come in this configuration due to import laws. So a lot of them are going to come in with essentially a plywood thumbhole stock, and then no bayonet lug, stuff like that, no muzzle device. And when they get into the US, that's when you have to have a company actually go in, swap out the stock, mill out the receiver sole, take double stack magazines, put a muzzle device on it, stuff like that. And that's where we get Arsenal Inc. in Las Vegas, who imported from Arsenal AD in Bulgaria the parts for the rifle and then manufactured them here with 922R compliance and all that fun stuff that you get with US legal system. And Arsenal really brought in quite a few different variants of the AK over the years. So mine, the SLR-107FR, has the folding stock as well as a side rail on it. More recently, we've seen the SLR-107R, which just has the side rail. It doesn't have the folding stock. The FRs haven't been imported in quite some time, and the Rs are still actually pretty expensive and difficult to get. The Bulgarian rifles that are easier to get but also incredibly expensive are going to be milled AK-47 variants, so they're SAM-7 series, which are incredibly high quality, but again, they're going to be very heavy and expensive. And I think that's going to cover our very, very high-level wave top overview of the AK, its lineage, as well as the Arsenal rifle series. So let's go ahead, get in a close look at mine and see how I have it set up. Alright, so starting from the front here, we do have that AK-74 style muzzle brake, which is pretty good. It actually does a good job with recoil compensation. However, it also flashes quite a bit. And it is held on there with a little pin up top that's just spring loaded, so you can press that in to remove it. And underneath, it's a 24 by 1.5 millimeter thread pitch. Now you can see we also have that front sight block up front there, as well as a 90-degree gas system there. The original AKs actually had a slanted block up front. Now you can see on mine, because I was an idiot about 10 years ago when I got this rifle, I removed the original handguard retainer to use a Zukov handguard, and I still regret that to this day, but currently I am using a Midwest Industry rail system on here, which works very well. It gives me M-lock, and then I also have a little pistol grip down below, which kind of gives the feel of a more modernized Romanian dong. Now moving back to the optic, I just have a Romeo MSR Gen 2 on a Midwest Industries rail, and we'll see more of that on the other side. And then the classic AK controls here on the right side of the rifle, so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And my personal favorite AK magazine, the original Bakelite mags, which are just beautiful red color. Now currently I have a Tapco G2 trigger in here, as well as a Magpul MOE grip for the AK. And the stock itself is going to be a polymer stock, which is kind of more modern compared to the AK-74. And then there's a little butt trap in the back there for a cleaning kit. And moving over to the left side, not a whole lot to see here. We just have our muzzle brake and front sight block again, as well as our gas block and my idiot mark there. There's the M-lock handguard as well as the grip, and then we can see the markings on the side of the receiver and give you a good look at those there. And then you do have that Midwest Industries side rail mount here along with that SIG optic and the Bakelite magazine. And then you can see Up at the front of the receiver there is the latch to hold the buttstock to the left side, and you have to remove the optic mount to be able to fold the stock to the side. There's the button there for it, and there is a cutout in the stock to fit over that side rail. And that's really all there is to see on the left side. All right, so let's go ahead and kick off the ratings with accuracy, where I'm going to give the SLR a 2. At 100 yards using 123 grain ammunition, I was able to get a 3.6 MOA group with this rifle. So that's about combat accurate. Over the years, the AK has always had a reputation of being inaccurate. I would say that's actually kind of overblown. I will say it's not the most accurate rifle in the world, particularly with 7.62x39, which is inherently a fairly inaccurate cartridge. But particularly with 5.45 or 5.56, AKs can be pretty accurate. Maybe not as much as a quality AR-15, but they are definitely better than most people think they are. And next up we have Aftermarket, where the SLR is going to get a 5, and that's because short of the AR-15, the AK series of weapons has the most aftermarket support, except for maybe like the Ruger 1022. But basically every single part on this rifle you can find an alternative for, and there's 100 different companies making parts: Midwest Industries, JMac Customs, RS Regulate. I can't even list them all, but as far as components on the AK go, you can swap out the muzzle brake, you can get different handguards, you can swap out the piston if you want to use the RS Regulate one, which is going to be better for suppressing the rifle. You have different side rails from AK Master and from RS Regulate, Midwest Industries. And then you have different stock options, and there's some different things there because of course there are quite a few different variants of stocks on AK. So you'll have your underfolder AKs, you'll have a fixed stock variant, you'll have Zastava, which has their own kind of fitment there, and then you'll have the, I believe, 4.5mm pin version of the folding stock they have on this guy. So that's one thing, if you own an AK, know what kind of stock it actually uses, because there are definite differences there. And then there's also different pistol grip variants for this rifle as well. The original Russian style ones are generally pretty uncomfortable. They're very, very thin and fairly short. So I replaced it with a Magpul grip, which is quite a bit more comfortable. And then you also have Reptilia makes a grip, so there's plenty of options there for that as well. Next up we have durability, where I'm going to give the SLR a 4. Now, as far as the construction goes, the imported AKs are almost always going to be better than US-made ones. Now, we'll say US-made ones have come a long way since they first started and were basically hand grenades, but AKs are actually more complicated to produce than you think they would be, and there is a lot of know-how that goes into it, and doing things properly, making sure you have the trunnion forged correctly, the rivets are done correctly. For the stamp receiver, you want to make sure there's a dimple before you put the rivets in there so they actually sink into the receiver in the correct way. And that's where Arsenal does a fantastic job, because this rifle was produced to the correct specs using all the right techniques to be able to hold up over time. And the steel is good quality. Of course, the milled receiver AKs are going to be more durable over time because they are literally tanks and they feel like it when you carry them. But as far as the only concerns I have for this rifle go are some of the finish in places is a little bit rough. And that's because Arsenal originally finished these with a parkerized finish covered over with a paint. And if you put a lot of rounds through these, they can actually bubble the paint a little bit. So that doesn't look great, doesn't necessarily impact the performance, but that's been something that's been known to happen with these rifles. And next up we have Ergonomics, where I'm going to give the SLR a 2. So that's going to be a pretty low score, and that's going to apply to pretty much all standard AKs. So there's not a whole lot to see up front. Of course, you can remove the muzzle brake here by just pressing in this pin and then rotating it, but unless you're swapping that out for a different muzzle device, that's not really a big deal. Now, where the AK really loses points is its controls, because this is a very, very old design as far as how you actually run this gun. So of course you have the charging handle on the right side here, and it is reciprocating, but the biggest issue here I have is the safety selector. So as a righty, it's very difficult to sweep off the safety selector. You basically have to bring your entire hand up here, or you have to come over with the other hand to be able to switch it off as safe. Your safety selector is also a bit of a dust cover here, so you'll see there's a channel back here that the charging handle rides in. And this covers that up, so in safe, there's no ingress for dirt into the receiver itself. As far as actually charging it, as a righty, there are different ways to do it. You can flip the rifle over, come over the top. The way I usually do it is I'll actually come underneath with my left hand and then do it that way. But there are different techniques which make it a little bit faster, but it's never going to be as fast as something like an AR-15 where you actually have a bolt release. Now, speaking of that, the magazines for the original AK here. So this, again, is going to be my big light, or really, it's just a polymer magazine with some cool metal components in it. But you can see we have the classic AK little latch here that you use to go ahead and rock out the magazine, and then you put the tip in and pull it back for the AK mag. Now, there's different ways to actually do reloads on this, but again, they're going to be fairly slow because of this latch. You can actually use a spare magazine or your next magazine to hit the latch and knock out the magazine at the same time, and that's a technique I actually used in the Marine Corps when I did some foreign weapons training. But again, it's more difficult to use than a lot of other modern designs, and there's no bolt holes open. There are some mags like the Yugo mags where it'll lock open on the follower, but as soon as you take the magazine out, that bolt's going forward. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the optic mount here. So you can see I just have the latch, need it pulled down on it, and then we can see that optic rail on the left side of the receiver here. And this is where I can show you the cool AK-103 part, which is the folding stock. So there's this button here, which is connected to latch over on this side. If I go ahead and press that in, it'll unlock the stock, which will go ahead and flip around to the left side of the receiver. And you can see there's this cutout to go over that side rail, and then it locks on this latch at the front. Now, pretty cool there. And then you can just see in the end of the receiver. And to unlock it, there's going to be a little button here at the front. And you'll see right there in the stock. And up above this is actually a little compartment for a cleaning kit. So you can just pop that out by opening up that trap door. It's pretty easy to get back in there too, if you get it right. There we go. And to pop it open, there's this button here. You press that in, and that's a really simple component. It basically just levers that in there and pushes on this hook there. And then you can go ahead and lock it back open. And that's about all we have to talk about on the ergonomics for the AK. Next up, we have maintenance, where I'm giving the SLR a 4. As far as disassembly goes, it's incredibly easy on this rifle and basically all AKs. So you pop off your dust cover, and then you can go ahead, take your spring, your bolt carrier group out, all those components. You get plenty of room in there to be able to clean off your bolt carrier, and piston. You can get into the receiver and clean the locking recesses as well pretty easily, and there's a ton of room to be able to access the trigger. And you can also very easily take off the gas cylinder so you can get in there and clean that out as well. When it comes to replacing parts on these, it can be a little bit more complicated than some other designs. So as far as swapping out things like your trigger group, that's actually very easy to do, and you can replace it with an ALG trigger, which is going to be a lot nicer than the original one in this rifle. However, one thing to keep in mind is the original trigger is retained, or the pins are retained using a shepherd's hook, which is kind of a massive pain in the butt to get back on. So I would absolutely recommend replacing that with one of the plate style retainers for those pins. But as far as if you have to replace something like a bolt, it's going to be a little bit more difficult on the AK, because I would absolutely recommend checking your head spacing with it. With the AR-15, all the parts are standardized pretty much across the board. So if you put a bolt in the rifle, it's probably going to be fine, to the point where I'm not super concerned about checking head spacing. With the AKs, considering how many different countries made them and if they're all made to the exact same spec or not, I would absolutely check head spacing, and that can be an issue. You might actually have to employ a gunsmith to properly make sure the headspace is right for the rifle. Next up, we have modularity, where I'm going to give the SLR a 3. So there is quite a bit you can do to change around this rifle. So for instance, handguards, there's a ton of different options for AK handguards. And unfortunately, I found the Zukov one, which, yeah, let's not talk about that. But there are plenty of options from RS Regulate, Midwest Industries, like I have on here. So you can pretty much spec this out to how you want. Zenitco is another really popular one that's getting very difficult to get nowadays, though. Again, stock options are out there as well. You can have an AR buffer tube adapter on these. You can have the solid stock like this, a triangle stock, so you can really tune that into how you want it. As far as optics mounting on AKs go, that is actually fairly difficult. For this series of AKs, you do have that side rail, which those are pretty good at holding zero. However, the options there are a little bit more difficult. And making sure you got the optic at proper height, it's not as nice as having an integrated Picatinny rail on the receiver. There are receiver covers that you can use to replace the original dust cover on here that do have a pick rail on them. However, those can have issues retaining zero as well, so that's something to keep in mind. There are also replacements for the rear sight, so you can have a pick rail that way, but in general, adding optics to AKs is going to be more difficult than it is on most other platforms. As far as changing calibers on an AK goes, you're really not going to be doing it because this barrel is pressed and pinned into the trunnion in the receiver, so it's a process to swap out a barrel on an AK. It's not going to be as easy as even an AR-15, so that's something to keep in mind. As long as you have it in a configuration you like though, just keep it the way it is from the beginning. And next up is price, where I'm going to give the SLR-107FR a 3. And that's because on Gunbroker, these are going for around $1,500 to $2,000, sometimes a little bit over on that. Because again, these rifles have not been imported in quite some time, so at this point they are considered fairly collectible. When it comes to shooting characteristics, I'm going to give the SLR-107FR a 3. Now, the trigger on the SLR is originally not very good. I did swap that out for a Tapco G2 trigger, which is actually a very nice trigger. Weighs in at about 3 pounds, 7 ounces, and it's very smooth pull and reset as well. So the AK trigger is surprisingly good compared to a lot of other stock triggers out there. Now, as far as recoil impulse goes, being a 7.62x39 and being a long stroke gas piston system, it's going to have a fairly thumpy recoil. Now, AKs in general are also, especially military ones that are imported, going to be overgassed. So that's something to keep in consideration as well. And that's one of the main reasons you're going to be getting a lot of recoil from these rifles. Now, that also leads into reliability a little bit, so we'll talk about that later on. But the recoil impulse is not the smoothest out there. This muzzle brake is trying its best, but that's still quite a bit of recoil. All right, now suppressor usage on AKs is going to be tricky business depending on where the rifle was made. So US made AKs are generally going to be okay to suppress, but when you're talking about imports, the standards are going to be a little bit different as far as what's considered important manufacturing the rifle. So one thing that comes up a lot is going to be bore concentricity. So if you actually look at the barrel blank, that's really how centered the bore is in that blank. And if the barrel concentricity is off to one side or another a little bit, that's generally considered okay with AKs, or at least it has been for a lot of manufacturers. However, that can really cause some issues if you're going to suppress that rifle, because of course if that bore concentricity is a little bit off to one side or another, and you put a can on it, you really run the risk of striking a baffle with that can. Particularly since with 7.62x39, the bullet's actually a little bit wider than it is on a 308, so it's a 311 versus a 308. So you have a little bit less room for error with a 7.62x39. So if you are going to suppress an AK, you definitely want to check your bore concentricity and use an alignment rod through the can to make sure you're not running the risk of hitting a baffle. Now on my rifle, the bore concentricity it's pretty good, but it's not entirely centered up, and it's enough to where while I have run this in the past with a can, I generally avoid doing it. I just worry a little bit. I get that one round where it's a little bit destabilized and I end up blowing up a can. Not a good day for anyone. So that's, again, something you need to check before you shoot your AK suppressed. When it comes to reliability, it's getting a straight 5. I put probably close to 10,000 rounds through this rifle over the years, and I have not had a single malfunction that I can think of, so it is an incredibly reliable system. When it comes to weight, I'm going to give the SLR a 3 because it weighs in at about 7.3 pounds. While it's quite a bit lighter than a milled AK, this is still going to be a stamped steel rifle, so it's not going to be super lightweight. And when we add up all 10 categories, the SLR-107FR is going to come out with a score of 34, which puts it up into the A tier. Now, for the SLR, some of the high points are going to be the aftermarket. There are a ton of different options for this rifle. It's also very durable and has held up very well over 10,000 or so rounds. And then the reliability has been absolutely on point with this. Now, where it gets let down a little bit is going to be the accuracy is not stellar. Some of that's going to be ammo related. As far as the ergonomics go on the AKs in general, they're going to be quite outdated compared to more modern rifle options. And then it's also actually fairly expensive for an AK. Comes to the cool factor, I'm going to go ahead and throw the SLR up into the A tier. And that's because these actually, or at least the AK-103 series, which this is essentially a copy of, pops up quite a bit in modern pop culture. And of course, AKs in general are going to be all over the place in movies and video games. Now, for the 103 in particular, in movies, it has popped up a little bit. A Good Day to Die Hard, there was a AK-103 in there, as well as Sicario, one of my favorite movies of all time. There's an AK-103 in there as well as Furious 7, there's one. AK-103 style rifles also pop up quite a bit in video games. So for instance, Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4 both had an AK-103 style of rifle. And then some of the newer Call of Duty games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 also have it, since it's one of the more modern looking variants of the AK series. Alright guys, and that's going to do it for my review of the Arsenal SLR-107FR. So please like, share, subscribe. Check out the rest of the videos I have on the channel, as well as a disassembly video for this guy. Again, I think it's the only AK disassembly video on all of YouTube. So I'm going to be coming out with more content here in the near future, so go ahead and keep an eye out for that as well.